just stop it. You have to accept that. Anyway, welcome to another class in Fish 501, and we are going to be talking to Carl Walters today, and I hope that you all had the chance to watch the YouTube and have some questions ready for him, or that however we're going to do that, who knows. That's one of the really scary things about for instructors with these flipped classroom, that you cannot really plan it in detail ahead, but have to think about different options and how we're going to be doing it. Anyway, I gave a long introduction to Carl, or not that long in the video, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But I will say that if you're working with modeling, there's no one that's more helpful than Carl when you have questions. He's the one. He really is the person you can go to, and not just about Ecopath modeling, but any kind of modeling and ecosystem analysis. So even though he's been retired for how long, 5 years or so, 6, 7 years, maybe, something like that. And before we shut down, he was the one who was every day at the Institute and being there to work with students. That's what he's been doing since before and after retiring. So welcome to you all, and let's see where we go with this session. Carl, do you want to say anything to start it off?
Oh, I don't know, unless maybe the best thing I could do is what we just did for practice beforehand, is to share one slide from the Foraging Arena presentation that's the main message to help you understand what that whole Foraging Arena discussion was about. Shall I do that? Share that slide again and see.
Go ahead. I already know which one it is.
Okay. This was the really critical picture, if you like, from the presentation. So this picture that my son William drew when he was 9 years old, and that appeared in a publication in the Canadian Journal. And what it basically says is that when you look at how animals behave, their most important behaviors are ones related to the ecology of fear. The ecology of fear, as an argument in ecology, says that animals have to balance two needs. One is to get resources, that is to be able to eat or filter or whatever. And the other is to avoid being eaten. But those two things are fundamentally linked, because the very business of feeding and dispersal and so on expose organisms to mortality risks. Sometimes it's mortality risks from buildup of parasites, but more often it's just exposing them directly to predators. So when we look out in the field at juvenile fish in particular, what we see is those juveniles having two basic behavioral states with respect to the ecology of fear. They are either spending their time, and usually most of their time, in relatively safe places where predation risk is low, but where there either isn't any food, or if they try to feed, they're in intense competition with each other in the restricted places where they hide from predators. Okay, and then they have to come out and forage, usually quite close to the places where they hide, just offshore in the case of juvenile fish that hang out inshore, on the edges of schools for fish at school, moving up to the surface for juveniles that hide down deep during the day, moving out of the rocks to feed on open bottom and reef fish and things like that. Okay, so this means that second behavioral state, where they're out in what we call the foraging arena, is the main time when they're exposed to predation risk. Okay. So what we do in Ecosim and related models is basically to look at those two behavioral states, basic behavioral states, as invulnerable and vulnerable. And then we predict the predation mortality rate just from the number of fish that are organisms that are in the vulnerable state. And this exchange model basically drives the form of predation rate predictions that we use in Ecosim. And that form, as you saw if you watched the presentation, is critical for constructing ecosystem models that don't blow up on you, that don't have competitive exclusion of a large part of the community, and don't self-simplify dramatically. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and let's continue with the discussion. So just whenever, if you don't understand any of the rest of that presentation and discussion about all the equations and so on, just always come back to that picture of organisms that are either in relatively safe states in the middle of schools or hiding or down deep or hiding under a rock, or out or they're exposed to mortality. And that evolutionary trade-off, evolution selects really hard to get them to optimally balance the way they spend their time. You don't spend enough time eating, you don't grow, you don't produce eggs. Spend too much time feeding, you grow fast, but you die too fast because the predators get you. So there's an optimum. That's always, nature's always selecting for an optimum behavior there. And that fine scale thing is utterly crucial to the overall dynamics and stability of ecosystems and our ability to model them now. So I won't say any more. Let's see what you have to say.
Any questions? Is that because it's all straightforward, all good, or is it complicated?
I think I'm just I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the equation.
Oh, the basic foraging arena equation is what's called a first order linear equation, and it's the idea there is that this exchange of individuals back and forth between these behavioral states goes on very rapidly. It goes on in timescales of minutes to hours. And when you have a dynamics that's that fast, it reaches a basic equilibrium very quickly in time. So all we do is to write the rate equations for the exchanges, those three exchanges, vulnerable to invulnerable, vulnerable back, and predation. We just write a rate equation for that, and then we solve for the value of the vulnerable density at equilibrium when the rates balance. So it's the basic equations are built around the idea that there is a moving equilibrium over time in the density of vulnerable animals that depends on how many are there to become vulnerable and how fast they're being removed. And the ecosystems are always staying close to equilibrium with respect to that very rapid process of moving back and forth. So I mean, it isn't even really calculus. You just write down the rate equation, set the derivative to 0, and then solve for the vulnerable density. Did that make sense? Did that answer your question, where the equations came from?
That made a lot more sense.
Yeah. This is something that we do a lot actually in modeling is we'll write a rate equation for how fast things happen, dx dt equals f of x. And then we'll set that derivative to 0 and see what we can calculate things to be like when the derivative is 0. How the values of a variable depends on the things that are affecting the rates. It's a very powerful way of understanding things like equilibrium yields in fish population models, ecosystem equilibrium, what they look like, and a whole lot of things. It isn't that any real ecosystem is or behavior is ever at equilibrium, but it's a value around which things tend to vary. So it's essentially what, if you had fish assessment courses, it's what we call reference point calculation, where we set the derivative to 0 and see what things would look like at that situation. It's very central in fish harvest management, this idea of reference point biomass is relative to an unfished average population size, an unfished average equilibrium of population or an ecosystem.
So thinking back, I'm thinking of your graph that had the, that was getting sort of asymptotic. Would that then related to this equation be essentially plotting the different densities of fish?
The asymptotic thing you saw, I think, was a prediction of the mortality rate that the fish would suffer as a function of predator abundance. And what it's shown is that the rate of movement out to predators, the predation mortality rate, reaches a limit, an upper limit, because the vulnerable densities get driven down to 0. So the equilibrium of the vulnerable density gets close to 0, so the predation mortality rate can't go up anymore. The animals are becoming vulnerable as fast as they can, and the predators are picking them off as soon as they do. But that limits how much the predators can actually get. That limitation on predation rates is critical to stability in ecosystems. If it weren't there, we would see Lotka-Volterra cycles and other nasty things like that.
It's remarkable how stable models are when we include the foraging arena. It really has made a profound difference. Yeah. And one aspect of this, or one related aspect, is that we pay a price if we have to estimate parameters in models. The more you estimate, the more parameters you have, the more you have to estimate, the more uncertain it becomes. So in the case of the foraging arena, it really boils down to one vulnerability related multiplier that we estimate, and we call it vulnerability. We'll be talking much more about that when we get to fitting to time series.
Yeah, technically that's a nasty problem, but one key thing here is that when we look at long time series of abundances of things, we see a huge amount of variation. We don't see things sitting at equilibrium and so on. But what this theory is telling us is that what's moving over time in a lot of these situations is the habitat embedding of the trophic interactions. So Will's picture there, we're showing those little fish around. What's changing is the environmental structure surrounding the trophic interactions. The trophic interactions are always trying to bring the system towards a simple equilibrium, but it's that equilibrium that's moving up and down a lot that's causing very large fluctuations in ecosystem structure. And in the case of things like climate change, it's progressive shifts in what you might call the carrying capacity out there that we're seeing. And things are following those moving equilibria and opportunity up and down. So most of the variation that we're seeing is not due to unstable trophic interactions, which produce things like predator-prey cycles and so on. It's other drivers, environmental drivers.
Carl, you mentioned carrying capacity. Should we talk about this? I should.
Well, we just did. I think that's what was it Paige asked about, wasn't it? That saturating relationship.
Should go more up like this. Yes, but how this relates to vulnerability and carrying capacity?
Well,
Do you want to bring up your figure?
Which figure are you talking?
Is this one here?
I'm not sure what you're asking there, really.
When
we say
I thought we should explain the vulnerability multiplier and how it relates to carrying capacity.
I'm not sure I know of a good picture to explain that. The basic thing that's a problem with what you're asking here is that you haven't been clear about what you mean by carrying capacity. When I use that word, I refer to carrying capacity as the biomass that a population will reach when it isn't being exploited. Okay. And that would be a dome shape.
If you take slide 21 in your set, Foraging Arena.
Oh, goodness me. 21?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the mortality rate. Oh, okay. Yeah, what about it?
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to bring it up. I can do it. Well,
what you go ahead and bring it up. What it says is that that as predator abundance increases, the amount of not just the mortality rate they cause on their prey, but the amount of food that they can acquire reaches an upper limit because of the behavior of their prey. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. So think of the y-axis as also an indicator not only of predation mortality rate on the prey, but of how much food the predators get. So it's total food consumption versus predator abundance. Then think of another line that goes up with predator abundance, which is how much mortality they suffer. And their food intake must be net food intake after assimilation. So it has to be greater than that mortality loss or they would decline towards extinction. So where that other line crosses their intake line is where the carrying capacity population size is. So it's kind of like that traditional mass action line, but shifted down and to the right so that it's representing as predator abundance increases, the balance between what predators take in on the high curve and what they lose to mortality on the low curve. Is that making sense? Do you want to draw that?
No, I didn't get what you were just saying there. High curve, low curve, and lose to predation. What do you mean?
I don't know how to draw this. Okay, let's go back to the picture you were drawing on the screen. You were drawing that picture of something.
Yeah. So we have
yeah, but why? Okay, so the x-axis is abundance of a species, biomass. So don't call it predator. Just call it biomass.
Okay.
Of the species.
Yeah.
All right, and on the y-axis we have two numbers. Energy gain.
This here is predation mortality.
No.
No?
Instead of predation mortality, let's put total food eaten.
Oh, okay, we can do that.
Okay, that's proportional, and that goes up to an upper limit, just like the mortality rate curve does.
Ah, that was not good. Erase. Once more.
So show the same mortality rate. Okay. So the upper limit on this is set by the rate at which prey become available to the biomass to the biomass to eat it. Okay. So there's a limit on how much food will ever be available to any species, set by the behavior of its prey species under the foraging arena.
And you're saying that there's no clear definition of carrying capacity. That's true, and it varies and so on.
No, there is a clear definition. Let's finish this. Now draw a dotted line that goes straight out of the origin and goes up as a straight line below the food eaten, way below the food eaten line, and goes up and intersects it at a high level there.
You want a straight, I'm just
a straight line. So
that'll
represent the bigger the biomass is, the bigger is the biomass loss. Put it down.
You're talking about something like this?
Yeah, okay. So the bigger the biomass is, the more loss of what's eaten occurs as mortality of the organism and non-assimilation and other things. So the biomass will come to balance where the loss and gain lines are equal. So the heavy line is the gain line and the thin line is the loss line. So the net growth rate of biomass will be the heavy line minus the thin line. Now, what's the shape of that difference between what you take in and what you lose? What's the shape? What shape does that have?
Are you talking about loss because of activity and predation risk, or?
It's all the mortalities that happen to the biomass. All the losses associated that the biomass incurs. Predation mortality and natural losses and digestion and metabolism and everything else, they all go up proportional to the biomass that's present at any time. Okay. So if you look there at a biomass about halfway over to where the two lines cross, go over to there. Okay, now go up to the loss line. Now draw the difference between the gains and the losses. Just show a little vertical line there between those two. Okay, that vertical line is basically what we call surplus production. So the organism's taking in, at that biomass, it's taking in more net food intake than it's losing to metabolism and predation and other things. Fair enough? So how does that little vertical line change with the biomass of the population? Well, it starts out low when the population is low because there aren't very many animals eating. And then it goes to zero when the biomass gets up to where losses and gains balance. And in between those points, it's a dome-shaped curve that goes to zero where the population is at carrying capacity. Fair enough?
Yeah, no, the only thing, when we start this off, I thought you were talking about the mass action, and that's why I put the line all the way up there. Wouldn't it be more reasonable if this line had gone out here?
Oh, sure, if you want. I mean, you can scale your graph that way. You can scale it. Yeah.
let me just do that, because then I have a chance of following it. So this here would be the loss line. It would be something like this instead.
Right, yeah. So where those two lines meet is, and we're on the biomass axis, you have a little vertical tick right there. That's the carrying capacity biomass.
Yeah, out here.
Yeah. And
Yes.
you got a little tick on your x-axis there.
Yes.
So basically the argument in foraging arena theory is that surplus production, the difference between mortality and intake, is created by this limitation on food intake. If there weren't a limitation on food intake, then associated with the behavior of the food organisms, or the impact of the predator on the food organisms, that upper line wouldn't have a limit, and it would just keep going up, and population size could just keep growing until some kind of Malthusian collapse occurred. Elena is asking a question there.
Oh, I can't see that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's probably a stupid question, but I am not understanding.
That's the only ones we can answer. Remember that?
Yeah, that's true. A naive question. I don't quite see why the straight line is the loss line. Could you just repeat that once more, please?
It's saying what that line is saying. Remember, this is not time on the x-axis. It's biomass. So the larger the biomass is, the larger, proportionally larger, is the loss of biomass to mortality agents of all sorts. Okay? It may curve upward instead of being a straight line. That is, mortality rates may increase as the population gets larger, in which case we say that there's density-dependent mortality, which does happen. But the key thing is that the surplus, the difference curve still looks basically the same, whether losses are just a proportion of what's there each unit at a time, or go up more rapidly. So over time, because food organisms, abundance is changing, the blue curve is shifting up and down. And because mortality rates are changing, predation and fishing and so on, the red line is also shifting up and down. So that thing that Billy wants to call carrying capacity is moving over time.
But if we, but you know, it's really neat that we can get carrying capacity on a simple graph like this, and we have some relationship to what it means. Now, you can think of this as in our start situation, when we start a dynamic simulation, there is a carrying capacity. Now, a year later, it will be different because the environment changes, the composition of the ecosystem changes, and so on. But we can keep track of that. At least we can try to keep track of it. That's what we do. Yeah.
Think about this. That curve representing the difference between what organisms can take in from their environment and how much they lose back to the ecosystem, we call the surplus production curve difference. Okay, there is a lot of ecological or fisheries modeling and analysis of historical data that's based on assuming that that curve is stable over time. Okay, that is, that curve defines something called a logistic growth pattern. And a lot of fisheries assessments, like the CMSY assessments done in the Sea Around Us project and so on, are all built on the notion that those two curves don't change. That the only thing that changes the red line loss curve is fishing mortality to increase the loss. So that they try to fit a single curve to over long periods of time to all sorts of data sets. And it fails a lot of the time because it's not true that there's a single intake curve, a single blue curve, and it's not true that there's a single loss line due to factors other than predation. other than fishing, rather.
So there's one more thing we should cover with this one. That relates to when we start off our model, we have a biomass, but we just don't know where it is on this axis here. How close are we to carrying capacity and not? Now the default assumption when you start off, if you just use default parameters, is that we are just around here. Which I say because maybe more like there. And that's because if we go up here to that curve, going to cheat a little bit, and we go over here. I didn't make it. Let me just show you what I mean. This here is the upper level in the given situation. I'm just going to remove this again.
Yeah.
Oh, I lost the line down there. It's not easy to do this on the fly. I'm going to draw it again. That's going to be red or green. And I'm going to go here. Oh, can't do that. That's the default assumption.
The default assumption on the red line is that it just meets no, it doesn't meet there. It meets down at the point where it's starting to bend over. The equilibrium is down where your dot is. The Ecopath equilibrium is way down there.
I have no idea what you mean by Ecopath equilibrium.
Well, the Ecopath mass balance,
yeah,
the food intake is balanced by mortality.
It's balanced everywhere.
Yeah, it's balanced everywhere. So if the Ecopath assumption is that you're down there at that low point, that is then there's surplus production. If there's surplus production, the biomass is not at equilibrium.
Oh no, okay. Now, but in Ecosim, the default is like this.
Oh, in Ecopath as well. Oh, yeah. If you do it just as total food eaten rather than the net intake going into
yeah.
surplus production, yeah.
And saying that because if you take the ratio for how much food could this predator eat, then you would say if this predator, instead of being here, which we assume with the default values in Ecosim, remember just the default, if this predator was to grow to its carrying capacity, how much would it increase how much more food would it eat? So how much would it increase the predation mortality it's causing on its prey? It could double it. That translates to what we call a vulnerability multiplier of 2. So that's the default assumption. And we can move that assumption by changing this ratio between how much can it eat to how much. The ratio between those two is roughly 2 in this situation here. This is pretty critical for understanding most important parameter in time dynamic modeling with Ecosim. It's not just numbers. They have a meaning. Relate to where are we relative to carrying capacity.
I wouldn't talk about it that way.
I always talk about it this way.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term carrying capacity to refer to
it's the carrying capacity in the given situation.
It's the carrying. The carrying capacity results from the balance between intake and loss. That balance is in Ecopath is occurring at not where total possible food intake is maximum, but where mortality balances intake, which is down at a much lower biomass.
Well, we can in this case
okay.
here,
Paige is asking a question again. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering what the reasoning is for the being half of the carrying capacity, or
for that thing, yeah.
There is a slight reasoning in this, in the sense that it has to do with the behavior of the Lotka Volterra versus foraging arena, how the models behave, how stable they are. That made us choose that original, that factor 2 roughly for.
It's not that vulnerability multiplier is not a biological quantity.
No.
Except for a few unexploited organisms. Suppose you were looking at northern cod. The biomass on the x-axis is cod. Well, right now, the cod population is way down near the origin there of the graph. The cod population is down at maybe 1/100th of the maximum that it exhibited when it wasn't being harvested. Okay, and it's at equilibrium there, or near equilibrium there. So production is exceeding mortality by a small amount, but the vulnerability multiplier there is much, much larger than 2. In other words, you have to set that vulnerability multiplier to 100 at least in order to simulate the recovery of the cod population back to what we would call its original carrying capacity.
I just made it here. It's more like 20 or something like that.
Right.
10, 20. The ratio between this one and that one, that's what we're talking about. That's our vulnerability factor.
So you can think of the vulnerability multiplier as how much scope for growth the predator has based on its ability to exert higher mortality rates on its prey. So if you look back to Willie's picture, those fish in the lakes that we were drawing, they were eating small zooplankton organisms. But most of the zooplankton organisms are not where they forage. They're out in the middle of the lake, and the little fish are restricted to a very small area near shore. So their maximum food intake is very, very low as a proportion of the prey population. The prey mortality rate that they can exert is very, very low. So the vulnerability maximum ratio there is more like 1.1. That no matter how many little fish you had, if they're all squeezed in near shore and they're all feeding near shore, they just can't cause any higher mortality rate on that big zooplankton population that's away from shore and not where they are. This is basically how coral reefs work also. Most fish on coral reefs are herbivores eaten on the reef or planktivores eating plankton that's being swept onto the reef. But the plankton is being produced over a huge oceanic area and currents are carrying it to the reef. So the reef population can never have any impact on its zooplankton supply because that supply is huge. Yet the fish see intense localized competition on the reef because the tiny population of plankton that's on the reef at any moment is severely depleted by them as they forage on it. So there you have a vulnerability multiplier that's like 1.00001. They can't cause any higher mortality on the regional zooplankton population, but can still have very low vulnerable densities of zooplankton immediately around in and on the reef. And we see this. We can measure zooplankton concentrations as currents bring the water over coral reefs, and the zooplankton concentrations drop dramatically from the reef front to the back reefs, the upstream to downstream side of the reefs, as they get depleted by all the planktivores.
So what if the vulnerability setting in Ecosim, again, vulnerability is this most important parameter, this really important parameter that tells us something about where are we in a start situation relative to the carrying capacity. Now, what if the vulnerability is 1? Where would we be then?
The vulnerability multiplier?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you divide by 0 in the numerical calculation.
No, okay, I wasn't really asking you, Carl.
Oh, you're asking them, okay.
So we are starting at carrying capacity already? Is that what it means?
That's what it means. That if we are entering a vulnerability, if we change the default vulnerability to, in Ecosim, if we change that to 1 or 1.01 or something like that, we are saying that this predator is at carrying capacity in our start situation when we parameterize the model. So that's what vulnerability tells us. It tells us where we are relative to that carrying capacity, or expressed alternatively on the y-axis here, how much will this predator be able to increase its food intake if it was to grow to its carrying capacity? And if it's already there, that's 1.
If it would grow to higher abundances. I don't use the word carrying capacity here, really. I think it's just...
carrying capacity is such a great word, we have to use it.
Oh, God, no.
It means a lot of different things, and I don't know how many projects I've been involved in or heard about or some otherwise, who has on the terms of reference estimate the carrying capacity for species X in ecosystem Y, or that's
Okay.
That's something you have to feed.
Fair enough. I mean, it's just a crazy. Yeah.
It's crazy if you do not realize that the carrying capacity is in the given situation. Once we move away from t equals 0 and we go to t equal 1, we have surplus production if we go in and we say, let's do a default assumption here of 2. So we may have a surplus production for that group, and there's potential for growth because of the surplus production that there is for that group. Then next step will be different, and that's going to impact the carrying capacity too. So that's fine. It's in the given situation. That's what we related. The environment is going to change. That's fine. It's just make it much more complex. But it's nice. I really like that we can relate this to concepts that mean something. Just like when we start off with vulnerability, it relates to, talking about that. It relates to behavior, as Carl started off today talking about. You got this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think this is very similar to when people talk about a healthy natural population. So one of our faculty members was interviewed recently, I think it was on CBC, and he said he was happy that the harbor seal population in BC has built up to a healthy natural level, and it's a healthy ecosystem. So you ask yourself, what do you mean healthy population? That seal population now suffers very, very high juvenile mortality rates. The individual animals in the population, particularly the juveniles, are anything but healthy now. They're in an incredibly stressful world where they not only are having trouble finding enough food, their mothers are having trouble taking care of them because of food competition. And there's transient killer whales that build up in response to them being there, so that they're at very high predation risk all the time. So how in the world can you say that that population is healthy? The word health doesn't mean anything in that context. And it's just a real risk. in using the word carrying capacity in the same kind of way, it doesn't really mean anything.
Carl, Carl, it reminds me of something you talked about in the video that we watched before this class, when you were talking about the things to watch out for, and one of those things was how ecosystems can flip. So maybe we should talk about that. Between states there.
Let's just see how many more questions or any discussion people have about the basic theory, foraging arena theory and concept, and the way we've used it to build the ecosystem models.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I was thinking about invasive species and how, like, essentially, is that changing these curves and these lines, and that's what's affecting, like, that's why people say invasive species are so detrimental to a lot of native species, because it's changing that foraging arena.
Invasive species generally change the whole physical structure of the environment. So let's go back to Will's picture there, Billy. And let me just show you, just walk you through a few examples of what invasive species can do. Can you put Will's picture up? Okay. So look at those little fish that are up there in the shallow water near the shoreline. One of the most common things that invasive aquatics plants do is to fill that shoreline area in with aquatic vegetation, right? Which may or may not provide cover for the juvenile fish, but certainly makes it more difficult for them to move around and so on. Another really common invader in freshwater systems like this example has been crayfish. The rusticus crayfish in particular has invaded a lot of eastern North American lakes. Now, what it does up there in that shallow water where those little fish are, is that the natural situation is for that shallow water to have a weed bed, an rooted aquatic plant bed. And those little fish are actually not just hiding in shallow water, they're hiding in weed beds. And what the rusty crayfish does is come in and clips off the macrophytes. So it removes the cover that those juvenile fish are counting on, essentially removing the hiding place for them, with drastic impact on their ability to do the vulnerability exchange process, subjecting them, meaning basically reducing the size of their safe habitat drastically. Those little fish down there on the bottom in the rocks, some kinds of invasive aquatic plants cover over and build up around the rocks in such a way that the little fish can't, and drop detritus in amongst it, fills the spaces in amongst the rocks, so the juvenile fish don't have a place to hide. So what invasive species can alter the spatial organization of the ecosystem really dramatically in terms of access to resources. And then, of course, for things that they directly outcompete, the invasive species sometimes outcompete native plankton species and so on. They're basically directly removing food from the foraging arenas. By doing that, they're reducing the concentrations of prey available to the juvenile fish and other fish in those arena volumes. So invasive things can have a profound effect on ecosystem structure in a whole lot of ways. Another, actually a kind of neat example of an invasive species causing big ecosystem change is zebra mussels in Lake Erie in the United States. So if you go down, look down on the bottom there, where those little fish are foraging out in a foraging arena on the bottom on the mud, zebra mussels have built up to really high densities on those rocky and even invaded the soft bottoms. But their foraging arena is created by them opening their shelves and filtering the algae from the water column above. They have relatively limited access to that algae because they're stuck on the bottom. So their foraging arena is right there next to the edge of their shells, right on the bottom. But the biomass is large enough and the draw on the phytoplankton population in the water column above is large enough that in shallow lakes, they can completely decimate the phytoplankton population. They have turned Lake Erie from pea soup green in its natural state to a beautiful light blue, clear oceanic water system, which has caused huge changes in all the trophic interactions involving fish in that lake. Some species of fish have prospered, like walleye, can catch prey better because the water's clear and they can see their prey. Other species have been just practically wiped out by the buildup of walleye and other things that happen.
Let me give you an example of that. I recently spent a month at an institute in Denmark, which was by a lake, beautiful place, where there was this relatively shallow lake. They had an invasive mussel, and people liked it because it cleared the water and became very, very different system. Now, this also meant that in the streams leaving it, the plants there, the macro plants there, were suddenly getting food, much more food than they did before, because now there wasn't all the algae plankton to eat it. So they grew in the outlets, and that led to flooding there. So all the people who lived around it, suddenly they had flooding like they've never seen it before. So that's an unintended consequence, unexpected consequence of invasive species. Now, other cases which relates directly to this is if you take an example like the lionfish in the Gulf of Mexico, they came in, and when they came in, they were all way over there on the left of this carrying capacity foraging arena map that we're just looking at. The native species were naive with regards to lionfish. They didn't know it, they didn't know how to react to it, and it was really having a good time. Gradually over generations, that's changing, and you start seeing different behaviors, evasive behaviors. Fish are smart, don't forget that.
Now, one of the things the lionfish did in terms of Will's picture there is that the lion's foraging habitat is the refuge habitat for some of those species. So the lionfish is actually sitting right there in shallow water and it's sitting around the rocks and reefs and so on like that. So it has removed the safe refuges for a lot of species.
And actually goes back, it goes very deep too. So you can't just eradicate it by divers or anything. Anyway, we will be talking more about invasive species. And when we talk about them, one of the things we'll be doing is to watch some videos about it first, and then in class we'll be trying to take a model, put an invasive species in, and see what happens. How can we get the model to replicate what has happened in a system? It's really difficult. We can't predict if there's going to be invasive species, but we can say if zebra mussels are going to come into Arrow Lake or Shuswap or somewhere, what are the likely consequences of that based on experience from elsewhere and based on our knowledge of those ecosystems?
When the invasive species is a sessile thing like a zebra mussel and so on, we can calculate the maximum mortality rate that it can cause on its prey just from what proportion of the prey population, like algae or even in the water column anywhere near where down near where the zebra mussels are. So we can say, for example, that the invasion of zebra mussels into deep lakes is not going to affect the phytoplankton zooplankton community because it's just such a tiny proportion of the phytoplankton are accessible to them or vulnerable to them. But when you get something mobile, like a lionfish, all bets are off. You really have no way of understanding how how severely they're going to disrupt the normal ecosystem, or the foraging arena structure in the natural system that they're invading. they're capable of getting into all of it. Did you want to take a break for a minute here, Billy? We're
I was
coming up
just
on 10
I was
o'clock.
actually just finding my little clock here, because yes, I think we should take 5 minutes.
Okay.
And please think about questions. You must have questions, all of you, related to what we've been talking about and the videos and so on. So when we come back, please be ready for some questions.
Yeah, you need to help old Carl here, because I don't know whether you understand all this and it's really obvious and you're cool with it, or whether it was just too much for you and none of you understand it at all. I have no idea where you sit on that spectrum. So let's see where you are when you get back. Okay.
We'll ask you for comments when we come back.
Back in 5. I just thought of a really cool thing to do on Thursday. Thursday, we're supposed to talk about building models, right? Billy, you're muted.
Sound best when I'm muted, yeah.
Is that right?
What did you figure out for Thursday?
I'm not hearing you. Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
You are hearing me. Are you guys hearing me? Nod your heads if you are. Gotcha, okay. What we're gonna do on Thursday is we're gonna build a model of the Omicron outbreak. How's that? There's a little trophic interaction, ecosystem dynamics, where it's really easy to understand how you formulate a model for the dynamics of that situation. And you can also see some of the huge uncertainties that we have in making predictions about a situation like this, where we have very poor data for actually estimating some of the key parameters of the dynamics. But the dynamics themselves are easily understood. They're trophic interaction dynamics that basically probably has a foraging arena structure, but more likely has one of its main components is changes in the way the prey behave in response to the predation risk by that organism. And one of the main reasons Omicron is turning around now is the way we're reacting to its presence, just the way little fish react to the presence of predators in lakes and so on. That sound like fun?
It certainly does.
Okay.
And I should just tell.
Is muted.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, so you don't get to listen to anything from Billy. Okay, you guys ask me questions.
What is this?
Or raise comments. Or tease Billy. Natalie.
Hi, I had actually a question about.
Whoops, I'm having trouble. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Can the rest of you hear me?
I can hear you, Billy.
Okay, Carl, it's you. What is it? The pot they call the pan black, or was it? How is it?
Pardon?
I'm just teasing Carl for saying that he couldn't. That I was the one you couldn't hear.
Oh.
Was that your senior moment again?
This is Carl having a senior moment. You didn't hear a word I said about Omicron. Oh, you can.
No, we heard everything you said.
Oh, because my microphone
was still there.
It's laying there on the table. Oh my God.
Okay.
This happens, you will find more and more often as you get older.
Today, when we end the class, since we're just talking about Omicron, we can just have a discussion about what we do from next week on. But let's leave it for the end of the class, so we can. Which means let's continue the discussion here, and I would actually like to hear something, question or comment from each of you. We can go in order of appearance here. Elena, do you have anything you want to?
God, I don't know. I think there's so much to take in, and it's actually about my second time, like my third time, I think, watching the lecture of YouTube, because I attended last year. The one that was live, and then I rewatch it, and then I rewatch it, and I still, like, every time I watch it, I think I have like so much information that it's not that everything is clear and I have no question. It's just like there's too much to actually have a question. So I don't know if anyone has any specific ones. Maybe they can go first, really, because I don't think they have any, like, anything that we discuss. I think will be new input for me, actually. So
yeah. I fully understand that. I'll just raise your hand and you come after Dana. I fully understand that. And I can say I've watched Carl Walter's Foraging Arena presentation, I don't know, live 10 times or something like that. and I'm still learning new things from it. That's the
Wow.
downside, actually, of it being recorded. Now there is some kind of version of it, official version. It's like writing down the Bible or whatever you would say, instead of having it being an oral tradition.
Yeah,
But
let me say something here. Like this package that you got evolved over a really long period of time. It started out on that lake with my son Will. And so that was what, 1989, 1990. And these ideas snowballed over time. We first used the foraging arena arguments to help understand why stock and recruitment relationships look the way they do in fish populations. That was part of that lecture. And it was much, much later, 1996 or 1997, that we stumbled on the idea that maybe we could use that for to predict changes in trophic interaction rates in food webs. And that's evolved over more and more time. So when you look at something like that, and it seems overwhelming, it should be overwhelming. In my mind, it built up over more than a decade of coming back to it and trying to help Billy and others who are doing food web modeling and trying to understand why models in the past had failed. It's not something you can grasp in one sitting. I think that the key thing is to understand is that we have been able to implement that very simple core concept of behaviorally mediated trophic interactions into this larger accounting system that we call Ecopath and Ecosim, in a way that lets you look at a much greater variety of questions without that involve complicated food web interactions, without having to try to reason through every one of those interactions as it goes on. So the model is really what we call these models are what we call a deductive engine. They let you take a relatively simple core idea of behavioral exchange and then say, what does that mean when you put it all over in a big food web? There's no way for you to intuit what the consequence would be. In fact, the first time I saw a model with the foraging arena structure in it go from completely unstable to completely stable, I was shocked. It was one of our graduate students had asked me to try that in a spreadsheet. So she had this model like 60 species, and I had 60 spreadsheet columns. It was this horrible mess. It just blew up every time. You couldn't go 3 rows down the spreadsheet before everything fell apart. And then it just flipped. Yeah, so the reason we build models, period, is that most of the dynamics that we see in nature are counterintuitive. That is, you can't reason properly. The human brain isn't organized to reason properly about the consequences of these interactions. Let me come back to the Omicron example for just a second before I stop my rant here. What we find is repeatedly, we find people, including medical doctors, reasoning that diseases should build up as a straight line over time. Now, here's how much it grew yesterday. It should grow by the same amount today and the same amount tomorrow, and so on like that. And these doctors are amazed when they don't see that, when instead they see this crazy exponential process that is a disease outbreak. They continue to be amazed by it because their intuition about how to make predictions about that feedback effect is just not good. We can't even, without models, reason correctly about something as simple as that growth process. Fair enough. Never trust your intuition.
Actually, I think I do. I was going through my notes and I think I do have a question. And if I am still on my turn.
You are.
But at the end of the YouTube video and at the end of the PowerPoint, you talk about the complex dynamic behaviors. And one of them is the non-additive predation effect.
Yeah. I
got that right. And how do you know if you are in a non-additive predation effect? Like, does that make sense? That's great.
So tomorrow morning, I'm going to spend 3 hours in a webinar with the Washington Academy of Sciences, talking about the impact of the same example that you saw of pinniped predation on juvenile salmon by seals and sea lions, where we see that mortality rates of little salmon have gone up as seal abundances went up. And we have argued that seal predation is causing that higher mortality rate. Fair enough. But someone, as that little slide series showed, can argue that no, what actually went over time was water temperature, which caused increased disease incidence in those juvenile fish. And it was actually disease that was making the juvenile fish vulnerable to seals. And if the seals hadn't eaten them, the disease would have killed them anyway within a few days. Okay, that's non-additive mortality. Every disease ecologist has brought up this point, or parasite ecologist, that parasites and diseases don't have to kill animals in order to cause a big change in the vulnerability of those animals to predation. And that can have a profound regulating effect on trophic interactions by essentially exposing animals to the lower mortality. So the question they'll ask me tomorrow is exactly what you asked. How would I know whether the seal mortality impact is additive? What's my answer? What must I do to find out whether the predation mortality rate is additive? There's only one way for me to find out. Come on, somebody answer the question. Okay, I observe a mortality rate. I observe that seals eat 5 million coho salmon smolts a year. How can I determine whether cutting the seal numbers in half would reduce that to 2.5 million, that mortality loss to 2.5 million, rather than having it stay up at 5 million because they were actually going to die due to disease? There's only one possible way that a scientist can answer that question. Come on, kids, you're scientists. Budding scientists.
Does it have to do with the derivative?
No.
A model? You try it? I don't know.
No. Okay, think about it. The basic argument is that a disease organism that we don't know about is making these little fish sick. So the question is, would that sickness have killed them if the seals hadn't eaten them? What must I do to answer that question? It won't do me any good to bring little fish into the lab when they're sick and see if they die, because they might well do better or worse in the field.
I feel like you'd almost have to remove the seals from the environment, but I can't imagine you could actually go and kill seals and that would be okay.
Well, okay, let's talk about that a little bit. That is the correct answer. The only way I can determine whether mortality is additive or not is to remove the presumptive additive agent, or reduce the presumptive additive agent, reduce the seal population. There's no alternative to that. for a scientist to answer that question. Now, in that particular case, there actually is a defensible argument for reducing seal numbers, and that is to reestablish the historical First Nations harvesting of seals. Before colonization of the Pacific coast, the First Nations population was large, and that population had established itself not by eating salmon and fish. They moved down the Pacific coast as hunters. They were hunting mammals. And right up till the time when smallpox destroyed most of the First Nations community along this coast, they were still avid and active hunters for seals and sea lions. They're a super high quality food item. Their calories per gram is almost twice as high as most fish. They're relatively easy to catch because they have obligate haul out behaviors. The seals have to get out on the rocks part of the time. So a First Nations person without any special equipment can just hide behind a rock, jump out and club them. And that's what they did in very large numbers. Fair enough. And they made wide use of them. A seal is a hugely valuable organism to a First Nations person, right? It's meat, it's hides, it's for clothing. You can make Ulican oil bags out of it and haul Ulican oil all the way to Alberta in a sealskin bag. These things were prized. So there's a proposal, active proposals, not to cull seals or just kill them, but to reestablish that harvesting system that's been there for at least 3 millennia and has impacted the structure of that marine ecosystem for thousands of years. Fair enough? It could be considered the natural state out there is for those marine mammal populations to be at much lower numbers than they are today. Does that answer your question, Dana? It is. You may not be able to imagine people like us going out and killing baby seals and so on, but you should be able to imagine that there are people who have a long-standing traditional right to do so, and in fact are asking to have that right reestablished.
Oh, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, thank you.
Dana, did you have you had your hands up a little while ago?
I did, but that's just because Elena had asked for other people if they knew their questions go first. I'm perfectly happy to wait as we go through the list. It's not a pressing.
Well, you are next on the list.
Oh, all right, that works out then. Yeah, I definitely agree with Elena that I feel like I could watch that video 100 times and still learn something new every time. It was a very good talk. But I was just wondering if you'd be able to explain the predator pit. I'm a little bit foggy on that.
Okay, Billy, can you put up that things to think about presentation? Do you have it there? Can you bring that up?
Yeah.
I'm afraid to reopen. I can. Well, no. Let me reopen it. And I'll bring that presentation up. All righty. So let me share the screen. And I'm going to put this slide up. Get my pointer here. Okay. the discussion we had a little while ago about surplus production. So we have biomass here on the x-axis, just like in that discussion. Fair enough? Okay. In the absence of predation, of depensatory predation, the foraging arena food intake curve that Vili showed you implies that surplus production divided by biomass, that's the relative growth rate of biomass, should be high at low population sizes and then drop down to 0 at a carrying capacity level. At the carrying capacity level. Follow that? All right. So now when you introduce a predator that increases its food intake very rapidly when the prey population increases, the predator's mortality rate causes a big hole, a big drop in the surplus production as the predators turn on their foraging and knock the survival rate, essentially increase the mortality rate. But as you increase the herring biomass, the predators have a limit on each one of the, how much each one of them can eat. So a seals can, sea lions in this case, can only eat about 15 kilos of fish a day. So if you have a fixed number of seals, so you got a thousand sea lions rather, they can eat 15,000 kilos, or what is that? 15 tons of fish. As you increase the herring biomass, that 15 tons becomes a smaller and smaller proportion of the herring biomass. So 15 tons is a huge amount out of a herring population of 25 tons. It's killing over half of the prey every year. But if the herring biomass is up around 50 tons, that same 15 tons is only causing a mortality rate of 15 over 50 or 20%. So the mortality rate due to the predator goes down as the predators become satiated. So the net loss in production per biomass or mortality rate due to predation decreases, and the competition effects resume their importance in limiting surplus production per biomass. Does that make sense? So the predator pit is basically caused by predators switching on and driving relative productivity down. That creates the downside into the pit. And then higher biomasses, you come out of the pit because the predators are limited in how much they can eat and their mortality impact, relative impact keeps dropping. What matters to the herring population dynamics is not the absolute number that the predators eat. It's the relative impact, the percentage of the prey that are eaten by them. Think about another example, a fisheries example. I heard a student a couple of years ago bemoan the fact that 7 million tons of skipjack tuna are caught each year in the world's ocean. That seems like an enormous mortality, isn't it? 7 million tons of those poor little fish are being killed. But when we look at tagging data and other evidence of how abundant they are, the skipjack population of the oceans is at least 100 million tons. So that 7 million tons represents only 7% of the skipjack population being removed each year. So relative, in absolute terms, it's a big removal, but in relative terms, it's a tiny removal. whenever you're looking at population dynamics, what you always want to look at is not the absolute numbers of things. You want to look at relative rates, percentage mortality rates, percentage production and growth rates, relative to the biomass, not relative to an absolute scale. So did this answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. It's actually a good thing you brought it up, because it's really important to get used to this idea that whenever you're looking at dynamics in nature in general, you always want to look at the per capita mortality rates and not the absolute numbers of things removed or whatever.
Dana, would you like to read the manuscript that this is based on? It's not published yet.
It probably never will be. It's another whole other lesson for you there.
No, I will.
Yeah.
I have to do it, Carl. I have to get a sense.
Yeah, I would love to read that if that's
okay.
an option.
I will send the manuscript out to the group as an optional reading.
But before we go on here, one thing to think about here is that our x-axis is here is herring biomass, and you see these 3 red dots are herring biomasses at which the population growth rate is 0. They're just replacing themselves. At a low densities, they're replacing themselves because the predators aren't pursuing them. Then there's an intermediate density where their biomass is high enough that they can escape the predation effect if they get just a little higher in biomass. That's an unstable equilibrium. And then there's a higher stable equilibrium where competitive effects and predation effects conspire to produce a stable total abundance. In the graph here on the right, what I've done is to take this herring biomass and make it the vertical axis of the graph. So herring biomass is, the other graph is turned over on its side. And these 3 points are being plotted as points along a curve. So at a fishing mortality rate of used to produce this graph, maybe around here, there's a low equilibrium point, the unstable equilibrium point, and the high equilibrium point up here. Whenever we get this kind of folded structure, it's called a fold catastrophe. We have a lower stable situation, a high stable situation, and an unstable point in between those 2 domains. So if a population gets above this unstable point, it moves up to this level. Gets below it, it moves down to the lower level. So we say that this population at any fishing mortality rate has 2 stable equilibria. If there's very high fishing mortality, there's no stable equilibrium, of course. So this is the notion that that ecosystems out there, whenever compensatory mortality is present, there's the possibility for the system to have multiple stable states and to go from one stability domain to another and then hang in that alternative domain for long periods of time. And we do see evidence of this in some ecosystems, like in Eastern Canada off the Scotian Shelf. The Scotian Shelf ecosystem has flipped back and forth a couple of times between states that are dominated by large species and so on, to those dominated large benthic species, to being dominated by small pelagic species. And that seems to be this same basic mechanism at work. Okay, can I stop sharing this?
All right, Al, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Carl, for all this, for the presentation and all these questions. It's been great. Thanks for sharing. I wanted to come back to the point of introduced species, because I'm really interested in evaluating the capacity of the model to predict
you're breaking up, Al.
Equilibriums or these state shifts that invades. Okay, maybe my connection is unstable. And
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Well, I was wondering, Carl, what would you recommend as indicators to follow up on these, to predict these new equilibriums? Should I look for biomass, for carrying capacity, for energy or productivity?
No, I think, as I said before, what I think you look for is you have to look at the specific invader, and you have to ask what its biology is like. Where does it live? What does it do? And then you have to ask, okay, given where it lives and how it lives, what organisms in that ecosystem are going to be impacted by its presence? And then how will that feed out into trophic interactions?
Those cascades.
You'll never be very sure about this. When the lionfish first invaded, people didn't know that much about lionfish behavioral ecology. We knew they live around reefs because everybody's seen them in reefs in their native habitat. They're fun to watch. But we didn't know how effective they would be as predators. We didn't know whether the native fishes of the Caribbean would be able to evade them easily because they're not very good swimmers. And we didn't know that even if they ate a lot more juvenile fish, small fish, the mortality rates of those small fish are very high anyway. So at one extreme, we had a prediction that, well, we'll just have another pretty fish on our reefs. And it'll join the community of other pretty fish on our reefs and no big deal. And that's at one extreme. And at the other extreme was the prediction that it will build up to large enough numbers and is capable of eating enough small fish to radically alter the species composition of those communities. But because we didn't have enough information about the reproductive biology and stock recoupment relationships of all those fish that were potentially impacted, because nobody had studied them, we couldn't make a clear prediction about how much impact it would have. There was basically no way with the kind of data that had been gathered in that system to say. It was the same way with the rusty crayfish when it invaded lakes in northern Wisconsin and ended up causing pretty profound ecosystem changes. Those lakes had been the subject of ecological long-term research for 60 years from one of the world's largest centers of freshwater ecology, the Laboratory of Limnology at the University of Wisconsin. Huge long-term ecological research monitoring programs had gone on one of the main lakes that was invaded early on. They had 50 years of data on the natural ecosystem and how trophic interactions occurred in that system before Rusty arrived. Nobody predicted one thing about the Rusty, was that the damn thing would clip off the macrophytes. The Rusty was supposed to be a little predator and detritus feeder. Nobody knew it ate rooted aquatic plants by clipping them off from their roots. So one little tiny detail in its biology made it have radically larger impact than anyone had expected or could have anticipated. We say about invasive creatures, in general, the devil's in the details. And unfortunately, most of the details aren't known to us at the times of these invasions. You know, some things are obvious. When zebra mussels carpet the bottom of a shallow lake, it's going to clear up the water and things like that. But most of the invasions are much more subtle.
You have to mention the introductions as well. I'm thinking of the one that Larkin was involved in. What was it? Up in the lakes.
Oh, Jesus, Mysis relicta.
Mysis, yeah.
Yeah. People studying trout in big interior lakes of BC, Kootenai Lake in particular, noticed that rainbow trout in those lakes grow slowly when they're small because they eat insects and there aren't many insects. And when they hit about 14 inches and 25 centimeters in size, they start to be able to eat small fish, kokanee salmon, and their growth explodes. And so these big lakes always have a giant rainbow trout in them. Every lake actually has its own subspecies of giant rainbow trout. that's a specialist when it's large on feeding on small fishes. Okay, so it's a neat evolutionary story about all that. Well, Peter Larkin, a mentor of our institute and so on, and his buddies said, well, you know, we've heard about this thing called Mysis relicta, the freshwater shrimp, and it would be a perfect food organism for these rainbow trout to get them through that growth bottleneck that they're seeing and get them up to the sizes where they can eat kokanee and grow huge much more quickly. So they introduced Mysis into Kootenai Lake, and indeed the rainbow trout growth did improve and so on at first. And they was so successful that they introduced Mysis into all the big lakes of the Pacific Northwest in Canada and the northwestern United States. And then it turned out that this Mysis was the vampire from hell. It turned out that Mysis was supposed to be a filter feeder and eat algae and stuff. It turns out the little bugger is a predator when it can be. And it particularly loves to eat little tiny cladocerans called Daphnia, like the ones Will was looking at. Nobody knew that that was a major part of its diet when it has a chance. Because most of the places it's been studied, it's wiped out the Daphnia, so it doesn't eat them. Right. So this thing's ate all the Daphnia out of a couple of these lakes. And then Daphnia is the main food for the kokanee salmon that support the giant trout. So the giant trout population started to collapse because of this Mysis.
And then you have vertical migration.
Again, as a relatively subtle feature in the life history of that that introduced species, caused it to have radically different impacts in the ecosystem than had been anticipated.
And in the deep lakes, you have vertical migration on top of it.
Yeah, that's right. It isn't really vulnerable to the trout. The trout started eating it, but then immediately exhibited something it does generally everywhere that Larkin hadn't thought about. It moves down into the dark during the day where the trout can't feed on it. And only comes up at night when the trout can't feed because they're visual feeders.
All right, thank you. Where were we? Al, was that covering it? Yeah, there's a lot about invasive species. I put one recent dissertation on the chat, and there's a lot of references also in connection with the what we'll be talking about in a few weeks on invasive species.
Just one last comment about this is that when you're trying to put it into an ecosystem model, that's a good framework within which to really ask questions about things like what its diet is going to be and whether it's going to, which other organisms in the system is it actually going to be interacting with and how is it likely to do so. And sometimes when you just ask those questions, you realize, yeah, no, there are data that say that Mysis relicta eats cladocerans when it gets a chance, right? And those kind of things could have been incorporated into models. And those models would have warned of its potential negative effects. But just being systematic in building the model is helpful to some degree.
Kathleen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I had a question on the slide after the predator pit. So that same lecture that Dana was referencing. And you talk about seasonal predation, and then you talk about a spatially mixed assumption and a sequential targeting assumption. And I was just a little confused about that concept. If you could speak a little bit more about that.
Okay. Just think about that herring example for just a moment. So from diet compositions for sea lions, we know that something like 20% or 30% of their diet through the whole year is herring. Now, if that total biomass of consumption were spread through the whole year and over the whole herring population, it would be a relatively small mortality rate on the herring. Because the overall herring biomass is very large. And when herring populations went up and down, that diet proportion would go up and down because the sea lions would be spending their time taking other things through the course of the year at the same time that they were taking the herring, right? So our simple model that didn't include seasonality would conclude that that the 30% diet proportion that sea lions have of herring wouldn't impact the herring greatly at all. But the problem is that that 30% mostly occurs during a very short period of time when the herring are spawning. So it's targeting the spawning biomass of herring before they spawn. And it's doing it when the herring are spatially very concentrated in big schools that they form just before they spawn. So the searching efficiency of the sea lions for those herring is radically higher than it would be if they were just searching for herring spread out over a large ocean over the whole year. Right? So that's a case where the compensatory predation effect is only there because the fish are concentrating over a short period of time before spawning and making themselves very, very vulnerable to predators during that period of concentration. Most small pelagic fish around the world have this kind of behavior where they may be quite widely spread out through most of the year, but during the spawning season, they form these very dense spawning aggregations in special places, in estuaries in the case of some species, spawning aggregations even out in the pelagic also. And they just get nailed by predators at those times. The predators don't even have to search for them. The predator's rate of effective search, we call it, the area that they can, the proportion of the population that they can find in a unit of time is really, really high seasonally when these concentrations are occurring. It's the same way with fisheries. Fisheries that target spawning aggregations of fish are notoriously compensatory in their impacts on fish stocks. You can wipe fish stocks off almost overnight by putting a seine fleet on top of them when they're aggregated to spawning, for spawning. There was one case in Mexico I worked on off one of the little Mexican cities, near La Paz actually, where they drove a sardine stock completely extinct. That is, the sardine came and aggregated in the bay in a school, and a seiner went out and encircled the entire population for one last set and drove it extinct. The seiner knew where to look for them. It's the same way with sea lions looking for herring.
Great, thank you. Paige, do you have questions? A question?
Yeah, I'm like almost apprehensive to ask it because we spent so much time on it, but I guess I'm just still a little confused with the like curve that we were looking at earlier, with the like surplus production and just the like where
you should be confused.
Okay, cool.
It was not actually a good way to talk about surplus production at all. And surplus production dome-shaped curves can arise from a lot of different mechanisms besides just limitation of predators, of exposure to predators. They can also arise from depletion of the prey population. Right? So as the predator population gets larger, it can knock the overall abundance of prey down so much that each predator is only getting much less to eat. So it wasn't a general argument you were seeing. It was presented in a confusing way, and don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
No, I would never have used that mortality curve to talk about surplus production if Billy hadn't brought it up.
You brought it up,
Well, no, I was struggling. You did.
No, you
were
did. Come
talking
on.
about carrying capacity.
We can have a
in
blame
that
game here.
context, and, no,
Paige, we will be talking more about
it
this.
wasn't a helpful thing for us to have done, and we should apologize to you.
Oh, no problem.
Well, we will be talking more about this in next week. We'll be talking about the parameters in Ecosim. And in that, we're going to come back to this question here. Though the way it was presented there is without any discussion about surplus production. So that's the normal way. But we will, it is really fundamental. So we will be getting back to that.
Okay.
Which means Natalie.
Okay, so I have two questions. I think the first one sort of builds off of what you were saying about the seasonality. In terms of like functionally modeling it, would a migratory species be handled in a similar way?
There are instances when migration also involves concentration. It's concentration of animals in a small area that causes the risk of depensatory predation and fishing. So Pacific salmon, when they migrate, as they come onto the coast, they migrate through these passes and bottlenecks, and their migration ends with a concentration at river mouths. So there's a really high risk of depensatory predation in those cases. But with things like tuna migrating around in the ocean, or a lot of small pelagics have onshore and offshore migrations seasonally, and ontogenetic migrations from inshore to offshore. It's much less clear that we should see predators being very effective at following and targeting them. It's almost as though the whole trophic interaction structure in most of these cases is just moving in space. So along the Florida coast, the whole fish community practically moves north and south. The little tiny small pelagic fishes move up and down the coast, and the bigger predators follow them up and down the coast, and so on like that every year. So any month of the year, you'll find the whole ecosystem and all the trophic interactions in a strip of about 60 miles along the coast, or 70 miles wide along the coast. You know, it's more spread out than that. But okay, second question.
This was, where did I put it? Here.
Oh, before you go on, if you guys get into ecospace modeling, one of the issues in ecospace modeling is we try to model things migrating on the ecospace maps. If you model predators and prey, you got to be really, really careful that you don't generate spatial mismatches in the model between where the predators are and where their prey are at different times of the year, or your predators will starve to death. Yeah, warning. Okay, go ahead.
I'm looking at the slide where you were sort of graphing the predicted coho juvenile abundance with the wild and hatchery. I was wondering if there was anything that a mark selected fishery would do. Like, because say they're a fishery targeting only hatchery fish, would that alleviate pressure from a wild stock?
It certainly would, if there were actually a strong competitive interaction. It could make a big difference. There's a bit of a worry about this actually right now in the Georgia Strait out in front of us, because Washington State is pumping up their Chinook hatchery production again in order to at least partially to feed the southern resident killer whales, which is just a crazy policy. But anyway, they're doing it. And that is a marked fishery. All of the hatchery production from Washington is marked. And our fishermen are allowed to keep the marked fish when they're out there at all. But in that particular case, the important trophic interactions and competition may well occur while the hatchery fish are still small. And we're there foraging along with the wild fish in spatially restricted depth ranges and times of day, where competition may be more intense. And so in order for the marked selective fishery to have any effect, it would have to be catching those little fish. And that's not what they're allowing to happen. It's not what fishermen anymore like to do. Used to be, back in the old days, we used to target those Washington hatchery fish in January and February right about now. Right off the tip of Point Grey, there was a whole lot of the Washington fish moved right up past UBC here. And we would go out and fish for them in January and February, and they were only about this big. Not like salmon at all. They were just like those tiny trout, but they were super tasty. And Buzz Halling, the famous Halling of disk equation and predation theory and multiple equilibria and so on, Halling and I fished together, and Halling used to just love eating these little Chinook salmon for breakfast. They're his favorite breakfast food. So Buzz would insist that we go out and catch dozens of those little tiny things. And there wasn't any limit on them back then, so we'd bring them in, boat full of them. That would have made a difference if there were a lot of people like us. Could have made a difference.
All right.
I think we with the hauling anecdote.
Yeah. Hauling of resilience.
Yeah.
I think we've reached the end of the class. It's almost 11 o'clock. And somehow we managed to get 2 hours without having any presentations. And
so be sure that you review the video and so on from the Thursday presentation and go over the basic ideas about what is a dynamic model and that sort of thing, so that I don't have to do that with you again. And we will sit down and I will build with you a spreadsheet model for Omicron. And while I'm doing it, talk about review basic things that went on in the video.
And I could mention that it's not as if Carl doesn't have any experience with Omicron. He's been participating in this BC group of UBC group, or BC group of modelers for the last 2 years.
So is Billy.
And so that's a couple of times a week that group meet. So there is quite a bit of experience behind what you'll be talking about. It's not just arm waving. That's about it. It's been great, Carl. I certainly have enjoyed it. And I want to thank you once again.
You guys are most welcome.
And see you on Thursday.
Look forward to talking with you.
And yeah.
All right.
Okay. And I would just want to continue with us discussing when do we go in person for this class here. We have you see Carl shaking his head because we have the biggest numbers of ever, and nobody has any idea about how much it is. Just one little number there. Newspaper today, there are 3 of the Canucks who haven't had it recently, 3 out of 25. So it's definitely coming. I hope
how just out of curiosity, you don't have to answer, but I'd appreciate an answer. How many of you think you've had it?